Today, I'm going to be upgrading the front suspension on my CRF250L. As everybody knows, this bike has notoriously soft suspension. It is undersprung and underdamped to the point of, if you're a heavier rider or if you're carrying luggage, it's almost unusable without just beating yourself up from all the shock loads. This is the Racetech front suspension kit. All it does is adds a spring to the left fork. Because this motorcycle has separate functioning forks, the right fork has the spring in it, the left fork has the damping in it, and as I said, this just adds a spring to the left fork. It comes with a spring, a plastic spacer tube. The older kits came with a steel tube. This one is plastic. I don't have any problems with plastic on the face of it, but long term, I don't know how this is going to hold up, and under higher heat conditions, I don't know how well it's going to hold up, but we'll see. And it comes with a couple spacers and some preload washers, and I'll walk you through that step by step. The other thing that goes along with that is replacing the fork oil. You really only have to replace the fork oil in the left fork. You don't technically have to do it in the right fork, and you might even be able to get away with not doing it at all in the left fork, but you should probably replace your fork oil every, I don't know, 3,000 to 8,000 miles, maybe 10,000, but it's a good idea to replace it. It's not very expensive, and at the end of the day, it's really not that difficult. So let's get to it. There's no perfect order to how you do this, but one of the first things you're going to want to do is loosen up the front axle. And you'll do that by loosening off the two pinch bolts. These generally aren't too tight. Then take your 14mm hex and loosen the axle. At this point, you don't want to take it out, obviously, because all the weight's still on the front axle. But once we get the front end of the air, it'll make this a lot easier to get off. The next step is to loosen off the two pinch bolts at the top of the left fork. And you can do it next at the top of the right fork, and then loosen off the fork cap. Now, I don't have the correct wrench or socket for this, so I just used a Ford wrench, which is a style of adjustable wrench that, in my opinion, works a lot nicer than your regular crescent wrench. And they weren't on too tight, so there isn't a huge risk of damaging the aluminum caps. So just loosen them off, and you'll remove them later once they're off the bike. So now that I have the wheel up in the air, free to spin, I will remove the front axle. Make sure that you keep the wheel spacers together and then roll the wheel forward to get it out. Now what you have to do is remove the brake caliper from the fork. They may be a little sticky from the Loctite. If they are, just keep using your ratchet. Otherwise, they should be pretty easy to remove. And this is also an excellent time to inspect and re-grease your caliper. And then next, remove the fork guard. Then after this, the only thing holding the fork on are the lower pinch bolts on the triple tree. And finally, remove, or at least just loosen up, the lower pinch bolts. These will be fairly tight, so grab yourself a decent sized ratchet to try and break these loose. And be careful not to tip your bike over. And there we go. The fork tube is now free, and let's head over to the bench. So now, use your wrench and carefully remove the cap. There we go. So I'm going to put this on just a little bit and then just wipe down all the dirt away from the top of this. And this way I don't risk getting as much dirt into the fork. So now bring up the cap and put a 17 on the bottom of the cap, and on the nut below it put a 14, and then just try and break them loose. So they may be pretty tight because they probably have some Loctite on them. There we go. Drop that nut down lower, and then just try and get the cap off of the rod there. So I'm having a little bit of trouble getting the cap off of the damper rod, so I'm just going to take my Knipex Cobras with a piece of leather so I don't mar up the damper rod, and give that a good squeeze and see if I can loosen off this cap. And it's still gonna slip. Let's see if some rubbing alcohol can dry it off a little bit and make it a little less slippery. There we go. So that's the trick. Piece of leather, some Knipex Cobras, and then just wipe it off with some rubbing alcohol and the fork cap will come off the damper rod. Be sure not to drop it and put that in a nice safe place. Now at this point you're going to want to drain out all the old fork oil by cycling the fork. So I've got a clean container here just so we can measure out how much is in there. I know how much I'm going to put back in, but this is just for fun. And this oil is still looking pretty good. You'll know it's going bad when it turns all dark. So here you can see the fluid amount minus a little bit of spillage came up to almost exactly 600 milliliters. So now I know that I've probably gotten all the oil out of the fork because that's a fairly nice round number. Now I do remember hearing from the instructions that you're supposed to put 500 in the left and 600 in the right, but I'm going to double check that to make sure it's not the other way around. I just double checked Racetech's instructions and they suggest putting 500 in the left and 600 in the right. I'm going to guess that's because the spring takes up some volume in the cylinder or in the fork, and that's why you drop the quantity here. So again, I've got some Maxima 10 weight fork oil. That's what's recommended by Racetech, and I'm going to put in 500 cc's into the left fork. One of these bottles is 1 quart or 16 fluid ounces. So it's just shy of 500. I mean, you could probably get away with just putting one of these in there, but let's do what Racetech says. And there we go, 500. And there we go, 500 cubic centimeters. Here we go. Let's hope I don't spill anything. Not a drop. Nice. The next thing to do is cycle the dampening rod to bleed out all the air from the fork. This isn't that difficult and it doesn't take that long. Just to make sure that you stop hearing any gurgling noises. You should have a nice smooth action up and down. Just take your time. The harder you try to do this, the more air you're just going to churn up and work into the oil, so go nice and slow. Next, take one of the washers and drop it down, and then carefully add the spring. Next, carefully remove the jam nut from the dampening rod. And then you're going to want to take the plastic bushing with what looks like a bronze bushing, but it could just be, plated somehow. Let me rephrase real quick. Because I don't like plastic on metal, I'm going to add one of these preload washers to the top. Then put on this bushing and make sure that seats in there. Just look down and make sure it's seated properly. Then next you're going to want to add the plastic spacer. I'm going to give it a nice wipe down to make sure there's no dirt or debris on it, because once you seal this thing up, there's no filtering that happens. So whatever dirt's in there is going to stay in there and just grind up everything. So I just put that jam nut back on now, and it's going to be a little tricky to see what I'm doing here. But I'm just putting the tube down and trying to catch the dampening rod before it gets too low. So all I did here was try and catch the dampening rod, and before it got too far I just screwed on the top cap. So this is where things get real tricky because there's a lot of stuff stacked up here. I'm just going to put some pressure against this to hold that jam nut in there that's just out of view from the camera. And I'm going to screw down the top cap. There, this is a better way to do it. So turn this until it just seats, and then bring the jam nut back. And this is where you're going to have to use all 3 or 4 of your hands to now try and put this back together. And of course with the spring in there now, it's going to want to fight you the whole time. But that's okay. So just get a good amount of torque on that. And then you can bring the fork tube back up to meet the cap. And I'm going to try and clean out these threads just a little bit. I don't think it makes that big of a difference. And it would be a good idea to occasionally loosen this cap off to bleed out the air that's in it. Or just get a new cap that has a bleeder on the top. Those are both valid options. And then just tighten this back up. You only have to go just snug. Here we'll do the final torque on the bike. So right there is just fine. And there we go. All right, then just torque down both the clamp bolts and then reinstall the brakes. The process for replacing the fork oil on the right fork is exactly the same as the process we just went through for the left fork. The only difference being we're not going to be adding a spring. All we're going to be doing is emptying out the fluid and then replacing the fluid again, 600 cubic centimeters on this side. So now it's time to put the brake back on. And make sure, if anything, you torque these up properly. Brakes are probably the most important part of your bike, next to tires. I mean, without good tires, you don't have good brakes. Without good brakes, tires don't really matter. So I'll put all the torque specs down in the description. That way, they're there for easy reference for everyone. As I mentioned when I removed the wheel, It's a good idea to remove these caps and put a little bit of extra grease in there, clean them out, as well as clean and re-lubricate your front brake. These are maintenance items that, again, usually get overlooked. And try not to knock your spacers out and get more dirt in them. Have your axle ready. And then the trickiest part here is going to be getting the brake disc back into the caliper. And if your cap falls out into the dirt, don't be afraid, just step aside and clean it up again. And you might be fighting with this for a minute or two, but that's fine. You'll eventually get it on there. Now, do not make the mistake of tightening down the clamp bolts on this side quite yet. It's okay to snug them up, but once we get the bike back on the ground and the full weight on it, we're going to want to rock the forks a little bit and get the two fork cylinders aligned. That way they don't bind up and cause some serious problems down the road. But we'll get to that in just a minute. Next, it's important to put on the fork guards. And then that's pretty much it. Just get the bike on the ground now. So very briefly here, what are my final thoughts? Well, one, I was not expecting it to improve the bike as much as it did, sort of like the EJK I did last time. I can choose with the line that I want to take so much more easily, and the bike is now much more predictable, because on roads like this, and I do apologize for the wind noise, where you got puddles and ruts, and it just wants to drag you all over the place. Having that really soft suspension, it just kind of took you where it wanted. So I had to slow way down to feel comfortable at my skill level. But now that the front is a lot stiffer, and I feel like I have a lot more control over where I'm going. The other thing is that the brake dive is completely gone. I mean, it's still long travel soft suspension, so there's gonna be some brake dive no matter what. But as far as like the adverse brake dive, the brake dive that really made me feel unsettled and uncomfortable, the whole thing was rocking forward. That's completely gone. But it's been replaced by a whole bunch of squat, because the back is so soft compared to the front now, it rides like that, and it's a little weird. So I can't wait to replace the back with the YSS shock. I might go Race Tech, I might go YSS, I actually haven't decided yet. But the problem with that right now is that there's a ton of wheel hop, and whenever I'm going through stuff like this or washboard gravel, the wheel hop is so bad I lose a ton of power and speed just the wheel not being on the ground. And with how much better the front is, if the back can improve by that much, this will be perfectly set up for what I need. So until next time, see ya.